What if everything you were taught about the bottom of the world was a lie? 53 million square miles of silence, a continent larger than Europe, buried under 2 miles of ancient ice. They told us nothing lived there. Nothing could live there. They were wrong. In 1912, a map surfaced drawn centuries before Antarctica was discovered, showing a coastline that shouldn't exist. A coastline without ice. A coastline with rivers, with bays, with the unmistakable geometry of civilization. In 2006, a drilling team hit something 1,700 feet below the surface. Something solid, something carved. The report was classified within 48 hours. The lead geologist resigned the following week. He has never spoken publicly since. 3 separate expeditions, American, Soviet, Norwegian, all returned with objects that were immediately seized by their respective governments. Objects that didn't belong to any known culture. Objects that predate every civilization we have ever named. Objects that were erased from the official record. So here is the question that will haunt you for the rest of your life. What kingdom was buried when the ice came? And who, right now, is making sure you never find out? The air at the edge of the world doesn't just feel cold. It feels intentional, as though the atmosphere itself was designed to keep something locked away, to press down on the earth with the full, merciless weight of ancient secrecy. Antarctica. The name alone carries a gravity that most people never stop to examine. Antarctos, the place opposite the bears of the northern sky. A name given to a place that, by all official account, no human being had ever seen, ever touched, ever dreamed of before the 19th century. A frozen nowhere, a dead continent. A geological accident of ice and rock and howling, indifferent wind. That is what they told us. But what happens when the ice itself begins to talk? The story begins, as so many dangerous stories do, not with a dramatic discovery, but with a map. A single, unassuming document that arrived in the historical record so quietly that it sat in the Topkapi Palace Library in Constantinople for centuries, noticed by scholars, admired for its artistry, and fundamentally misunderstood by nearly everyone who looked at it. The map was drawn by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis in the year 1513. It was constructed, Reis himself noted in his own handwriting along the margins, from source maps, older maps, maps from antiquity, maps that traced lineage back to the age of Alexander the Great. And on that map, rendered in the careful, deliberate strokes of a man transcribing something he believed to be true, was the unmistakable shape of a southern landmass. A landmass with mountains, with river systems, with bays and inlets and the kind of topographic complexity that only comes from land that has been observed. Land that someone, at some point in the unknowable past, had walked upon, sailed around, and charted with a precision that would not be matched by modern cartography until the age of satellites. The problem, and this is where the ground beneath everything solid begins to shift, is that this landmass corresponds in extraordinary detail to the subglacial topography of Antarctica. Not the surface as we see it today, buried and smoothed under miles of compressed ice, but the land beneath the ice, the bedrock coastline, the shape of the continent as it exists hidden from every human eye alive on the planet today. That coastline was not mapped until 1958, using seismic surveys and the most advanced technology of the 20th century. The Piri Reis map was drawn 445 years earlier. When U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer reviewed the map in 1960 at the request of cartographer Charles Hapgood, his response was measured, professional, and quietly devastating. He wrote in an official letter that the geographic detail shown in the southern portion of the map was accurate to the subglacial topography. Accurate in ways that, and here is where he chose his words with the delicacy of a man walking on ice, We have no explanation for. No explanation. From the United States Air Force. About a 500-year-old Turkish map. The academic establishment's response to this anomaly was, as it almost always is when the timeline of human civilization is threatened, swift, and dismissive. The resemblances were coincidental. The projections were misinterpreted. Hapgood was a dilettante. Move along, nothing to see. And for decades, most people did exactly that. They moved along, because the alternative required asking questions that had no comfortable answers. But the questions were never buried. They were only waiting, patient as the ice itself, for someone willing to dig. Because Piri Reis was not alone. The Orontius Phineus map, produced in 1531, shows Antarctica with rivers flowing from interior mountain ranges to an ice-free coast. The Buech map of 1739 depicts the continent divided by a channel beneath what is now ice, a channel that was not confirmed to exist until 1958. These were not the guesses of imaginative cartographers filling in blank space with decoration. The level of internal consistency across these documents, produced by different men in different countries across different centuries, points to a single, terrifying possibility: that all of them were copying from something much, much older. That somewhere in the lost libraries of antiquity, in Alexandria before the fires, in the archive chambers of civilizations we have not yet named, there existed source material, surveys, measurements, the accumulated navigational knowledge of a seafaring culture that knew the bottom of the world when it was warm, and then the ice came. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas, a period of catastrophic climatic disruption beginning approximately 12,900 years ago, when global temperatures plunged with a speed that defies easy explanation. Within decades, perhaps within years, ice sheets advanced. Sea levels dropped, and then, as ice dams collapsed, surged. Coastlines that had been stable for millennia were erased. And in the southern hemisphere, the continent that would become Antarctica, which had enjoyed a temperate climate for millions of years prior, which bore forests and rivers and the biological richness of a living landscape, began its long, slow entombment. 12,000 years. That is how long the ice has been building. That is how long whatever lies beneath has been waiting. In 2018, a team of researchers from Columbia University published findings from radar imaging surveys that revealed an extraordinarily complex landscape beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. Valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, mountain ranges taller than the Alps, and scattered across the subglacial terrain. Anomalies in density and composition that the published paper described with careful scientific neutrality as unexpected. The word appears 11 times in a 30-page document. Unexpected, as though the earth beneath Antarctica keeps offering up things that do not fit, and the only tool available to the researchers is the quiet, inadequate word unexpected. What the paper did not discuss, what no official paper has discussed, because the data required to discuss it was not made available to the authors, was a cluster of density readings in a specific region of coastal East Antarctica that had been flagged in earlier surveys and then, with remarkable bureaucratic efficiency, reclassified. Not corrected, not disproved, reclassified, moved from the domain of scientific inquiry into the domain of governmental discretion. This is where the story changes texture. This is where the cold atmospheric chill of geological mystery gives way to something warmer and far more human. The deliberate, calculated suppression of evidence by institutions that understood. At some level, they would never articulate publicly exactly what they were sitting on. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 is taught in international relations courses as a triumph of Cold War diplomacy, a rare moment when the United States, and the Soviet Union set aside ideological hostility in service of peaceful scientific cooperation. 12 nations signed it. The continent was designated a preserve for science. Military activity was prohibited. Nuclear tests were banned. It was, by every official measure, an agreement built on the enlightened recognition that some places belong to everyone. What is discussed far less frequently is what the treaty also did. It restricted access. It created a framework by which any discovery made on the continent, any discovery at all, was subject to international review before public disclosure. It established, in the neutral language of diplomatic compromise, a mechanism by which inconvenient findings could be quietly managed. And it has been renewed, expanded, and strengthened every decade since. 47 nations are now party to it. The continent is the most heavily regulated landmass on Earth. You cannot visit without permission. You cannot conduct research without oversight. You cannot remove anything, not a rock, not a feather, not a gram of ice, without documentation and approval. Now ask yourself, why does a continent of ice and wind, a place with no indigenous population, no strategic resources of conventional military value, no territorial disputes of any meaningful kind, why does such a place require the most elaborate international access control regime ever constructed in human history? The answer that the official record provides is environmental protection. The ecosystem is fragile. The science must be preserved from contamination. These are reasonable arguments, and they are not entirely untrue. But they are also, for anyone paying attention, profoundly insufficient to explain the level of institutional machinery that has been constructed around a continent of ice. Unless the continent is not simply a continent of ice. The artifacts, and this is the word that matters, the word that carries the weight of the entire story, began appearing in accounts that exist at the edges of the official record. Not in peer-reviewed journals, not in government reports, in the testimonies of workers. In the deathbed confessions of men who had spent careers in logistics and engineering on Antarctic expeditions, and who, in their final years, felt the loosening grip of institutional loyalty and chose instead the older, heavier loyalty to truth. A Norwegian seaman who worked supply runs to research stations throughout the 1970s described, in a recorded interview conducted by an independent researcher in 1994, watching a crate being loaded onto a military transport aircraft at McMurdo Station. The crate was approximately 2 meters long and half a meter wide. It was sealed and marked with codes he did not recognize. What he remembered most vividly, what had stayed with him for 20 years, was the behavior of the officers supervising the loading. They were silent. They were not speaking to each other. And one of them, a man of senior rank whose name he did not know, was holding his hat in his hands and staring at the crate as it was lifted into the aircraft, with an expression the seaman described as grief. Not excitement, not military discipline, grief, the expression of a man watching something irreplaceable disappear into a system designed to make it vanish. A geologist contracted to a joint American-British survey in the late 1980s described, in a manuscript circulated privately after her retirement, recovering from a coastal ice formation, objects that she initially assumed were geological concretions, naturally occurring mineral deposits shaped by pressure and time. Upon closer examination, she noted that the objects exhibited symmetry inconsistent with natural formation. Specifically, they were pierced, deliberately and precisely pierced, in patterns that bore no relationship to fracture lines or crystal structure. In the way that jewelry or ritual objects across dozens of human cultures have been pierced for suspension, for wearing, for display. She photographed them. She cataloged them. She submitted her preliminary findings through the standard research reporting chain. Within 72 hours, she received a visit from two men she describes only as administrative. They reviewed her documentation. They took her photographs. They explained to her that the objects had been reanalyzed by a more senior team and determined to be naturally occurring mineral formations of a type previously undescribed in Antarctic geology. They suggested she focus her remaining field time on her primary research objectives. She never published the account under her own name. The manuscript she circulated privately was attributed only to initials. She spent the final years of her career at a research institution far from any polar program. In the manuscript, she writes with the flat, exhausted clarity of someone who has long since made peace with not being believed. I know what I held in my hands. I know the difference between what the earth makes alone and what the earth makes when it is being shaped by intention. Those objects were made. They were made by hands. And they were very, very old. Very old. Old enough that the ice above them had been accumulating for millennia. Old enough that they predated every civilization in the standard human timeline by thousands of years. Old enough to suggest that the frozen continent, before the catastrophe that sealed it, had been home to something that used tools, that created ornamentation, that participated in the ancient and universal human impulse to make objects that were beautiful. The jewelry connection, and it is this detail above all others that the imagination catches on and refuses to release, runs through multiple independent accounts, not weapons, not utilitarian tools, not the blunt instruments of survival, jewelry, ornamented objects, objects made not because they were needed but because something in the maker wanted to make them. Objects that in every culture and every era of human existence have served the same fundamental purposes: to mark status, to honor the sacred, to express love, to claim belonging. There is something in the specificity of this detail that feels true in the way that invented details rarely do. A person constructing a hoax about lost Antarctic civilization would give you monuments, temples, weapons of war, the grand architectural gestures of imagined empire. They would not give you jewelry. Jewelry is too small, too intimate, too quietly human to be the choice of someone trying to impress. It is the detail of someone reporting what they actually found. And what it implies is this: that somewhere beneath the ice of Antarctica, there are the remnants not merely of habitation but of culture, of a people who had moved beyond pure survival into the territory of self-expression, who had developed the leisure, the stability, and the aesthetic sensibility to make things that had no function except to be worn and to be seen, and to mean something to the person wearing them and the people seeing them. A kingdom. The word feels almost too small, because a kingdom implies a border, a seat of power, a hierarchy of nobility and common people organized around a central authority. What the evidence fragmentary, suppressed, circulating in the margins of recorded history, suggests is something both more modest and more extraordinary: a civilization. Not necessarily a vast empire sprawling across the ice-free continent, though the subglacial topography certainly offers enough habitable terrain to support dense human settlement. Perhaps instead a maritime culture, a seafaring people who knew the Southern Ocean in the way that the Polynesians knew the Pacific, not as a barrier but as a road. A culture that sailed, that mapped, that made jewelry and buried their dead and watched the stars and did all the things that human beings do when they have enough time and enough stability to become fully, irreducibly human. A culture that had no way of knowing that the sky was about to change. Whatever caused the younger Dryas, and the scientific debate on this question remains genuinely, productively open, with credible evidence accumulating around the hypothesis of a comet impact or airburst event approximately 12,900 years ago. Its effects were catastrophic and global. Civilizations at the margins, civilizations dependent on coastal resources, civilizations without the accumulated surplus to survive multi-generational climate disruption, would have been erased. Not conquered, not assimilated, erased, their buildings buried, their fields frozen. Their maps scattered into the libraries of successor cultures, who preserved them without fully understanding what they were looking at, and the continent itself sealed. A shroud of ice 2 miles deep drawn over everything that had been left behind. The jewelry, the carved markers, the architectural traces, the bones. All of it waiting in the absolute darkness beneath the ice for the world to be ready to ask the right questions. The world may not be ready. The institutions certainly are not. The Antarctic Treaty remains in force. The reclassification machinery runs quietly and efficiently. The researchers who find the unexpected things learn, in most cases, to file them away internally and continue their careers. The ones who do not learn this lesson find their funding threatened, their credentials questioned, their findings unpublished. But the ice is changing. Global temperatures are reshaping the continent at a pace that no institutional apparatus can fully control. Glaciers are retreating. Coastal ice shelves are collapsing. And as the margins of Antarctica become accessible in ways they have not been for millennia, things are emerging that cannot be so easily reclassified. Not by two men in administrative clothing. Not by the quiet machinery of managed disclosure, because the ice does not care about treaties. In 2017, satellite imagery captured a formation on the Ellsworth Mountains region of West Antarctica that has been variously described, in the cautious language of researchers who understand the professional. Risks of enthusiasm as a geometric anomaly and an unexplained structural feature. It is approximately 70 meters on each visible side. It is symmetrical. It is oriented in a manner consistent with deliberate alignment to astronomical coordinates. It is partially exposed, which means it has been exposed relatively recently, as the ice around it has retreated. The formation has not been physically investigated by any publicly acknowledged expedition. Its coordinates are known. They have been published quietly in geographic databases where they sit alongside thousands of other data points, unremarkable in their notation, invisible in their implications, unless you know exactly what you are looking at. And therein lies the final, most unsettling dimension of this story. Not the artifacts themselves, not the suppression of the geologist's findings or the grief on the officer's face at McMurdo. Not even the impossible accuracy of the Peary Rise map. The most unsettling thing is the possibility that the knowledge has never truly been lost. That somewhere in the chains of institutional memory that connect the great libraries of antiquity to the medieval courts, that preserved their fragments to the governments that classified the most. Recent findings. There has always been a thread of awareness. A quiet, generational understanding, passed between the people who manage what the public is allowed to know, that the official story of human civilization, its timeline, its origins, its precedence is not the whole story. That we did not begin where we think we began, that we have forgotten more than we have learned, and that buried under the ice of the most remote continent on Earth, sealed in the silence of a catastrophe so total that it wiped the memory of an entire world from the human record. There are objects that a person made with their hands. Small, careful, beautiful objects, made to be worn, made to be seen, made to say, I was here, I existed, I was someone to whom beauty mattered. The ice is not forever, it never was. And when it finally releases what it has been holding, the question will not be whether we were ready. The question will be whether we are honest enough to look. The air at the edge of the world carries a bite that feels like a warning. Or perhaps If you listen differently, if you let go of everything you were taught about what is possible and what is ancient and what is true, it feels less like a warning and more like a whisper. A whisper from a world that ended before ours began, still waiting, still speaking, if anyone is willing to hear it.